Cult classics can be created by any number of circumstances. Maybe it was one of those B-tier honorable mention games that had a beloved mascot or a unique mechanic that made it worth recommending to friends of those who experienced it when it first came out. Other times, the release of a high-quality though unknown game may be drastically impacted by poor marketing, leaving only those in the know to spread the word of its quality over the years. This second case was the instance for the puzzle-heavy action-adventure game ICO. Despite this game's cult classic status, it wasn't created by some small-time programmer or indie studio. Instead, it was developed by Sony's first-party Japan studio and the newly formed Team ICO, led by the game's creator Fumito Ueda. Originally planned for the first PlayStation console, ICO took an unexpected 4 years to develop and was inevitably delayed to the PS2, finally releasing in late 2001. Releasing earlier in North America than in Japan or Europe, the game's final cover artwork was not ready yet, and in its place, the game received a notoriously low-quality cover, which is believed to have dramatically impacted Western sales, alongside the lack of a more recognizable English title. By the time all sales were accounted for, ICO had only sold 700,000 copies worldwide, with about 1/3 of the sales in the United States and the majority of the remaining units sold in Europe. Over the years, and thanks to the success of Team ICO's later projects, their namesake adventure game has had a few more opportunities to be properly appreciated by the global market, being remastered and re-released on future Sony hardware, revealing to Western audiences what this game had going for it all along. For example, even releasing very early in the PS2's lifespan, and several months before the GameCube and Xbox even launched, ICO was among the first in the medium to feature a story told with minimal dialogue, soft bloom lighting effects, and the use of keyframe animation for smoother computer-generated visuals without the use of motion capture. While it couldn't really be considered an unknown gem at this point, it's still a game worth both dissecting and celebrating in the history of gaming. I think you'll understand why that is as we try to answer, what's so great about ICO? Our protagonist in this game is a young boy named ICO, who was born with horns on his head. In his village, this is a sign of bad luck, so on ICO's 12th birthday, he's taken away as a sacrifice to undo the curse of bad luck that has plagued his village since his birth. Crossing from the mainland to an eerie and seemingly abandoned castle, a faceless entourage delivers ICO to a prison cell among what are supposedly many more previous human sacrifices. As he breaks out of his cell while trying to escape, ICO is knocked unconscious and has a dreamlike vision of a shadow in the shape of a woman, trapped in a cell somewhere upstairs. Upon finding the cage from his vision, ICO discovers and frees the young Princess Yorda, the daughter of this castle's queen, who is planning to sacrifice Yorda in order to prolong her own life. ICO decides to help Yorda escape as he finds a way for both of them off this island prison. The relationship between ICO and Yorda was where the whole game stemmed from. During its conception, director Ueda envisioned a boy meets girl story where the two characters formed a bond by holding hands, though saying very little. Early on in ICO's development, the team determined that the game's composition would follow 3 particular pillars of design. First, that the game be different from others in the adventure genre. Second, that the aesthetic style would be consistently artistic. And third, that the setting would be both imaginary yet realistic. Ueda was also inspired by the cinematic 1991 adventure game Another World for personal computers, which featured a movie-like presentation with a completely clear heads-up display and minimalistic dialogue between its 2 main characters. In keeping with these inspirations, most of the game's story has to be inferred through symbolism alone, with more reliance on behavior than dialogue to understand what's going on. Yorda speaks in a language subtitled only by fictional symbols in order to create a sincere verbal barrier between her and ICO, and by extension, the player. Luckily, being the princess of this castle, she also has the very helpful ability of opening certain passages that allow her and ICO to escape through cooperation without the need for speech. The game is played from a third-person perspective with a camera that automatically follows the player through predetermined angles and distances. However, the player can also move the camera around independently of our protagonist for a better view at the surrounding environment. Players can move through the use of either the joystick or directional buttons, though the joystick is sensitive to more delicate motions for careful maneuvering of our hero. As long as the path is clear for her, Yorda will usually attempt to follow ICO on her own, though the player can also call to her and grab hold of her hand with the R1 button. Whenever holding this button to call for Yorda, the camera will adjust to show her location, even through walls, so that the player can tell where she is, if she's in imminent danger, and if she's having trouble reaching your current location. The player is also alerted no matter their location whenever Yorda is in danger, so there are no unjustified game overs without any warning. If you're unfamiliar with the game, this may prompt you to ask, what could threaten the princess's safety in this desolate old fortress? Well, throughout the castle grounds are shadow monsters who do the queen's bidding, trying to steal Yorda back from ICO so she can be sacrificed. If one of these monsters pulls her into the void that they spawned out of, then the player will be turned to stone and have to restart from their last checkpoint. Fitting with the game's notably soft lighting, the shadow monsters feature gaseous, incorporeal bodies without clearly defined models. While the shadows are the only opponents to be found, they do take multiple forms, such as more humanoid or monster-based ones, as well as creatures that look more like birds or insects in how they move. The size of each shadow also has a bearing on how much health they have. In an interesting change-up from how most action adventures unfold, the enemies in this game are far more concerned with swiping Yorda than with fighting ICO. It creates an impressively stressful situation out of only a few enemies, simply because of how one-track minded they are in pursuit of their goal, as the player takes them on one at a time, and the others don't just line up to fight you as would be expected in most video games. ICO uses a leftover piece of wood from a torch as a weapon, which the player can use to bash away the shadow monsters who threaten to kidnap the princess. Partway through the game, the player will also find themselves a sword, which can be used to cut ropes and deal heavier damage to enemies, though there will still be occasional puzzles which require switching back to a wooden plank for a while. Our player character doesn't have any specific amount of health, and outside of falling from a great height, doesn't often die in terms of the player being punished for failing combat. These ghastly shadow monsters that pursue our main characters only hit ICO hard enough to stun him for a moment, but other than trying to take away his friend, only tend to knock him to the ground in order to reach their goal. The desperation that ICO feels while doing the best he can to keep our two main characters safe is one of the best justifications I've seen for button-mashing combat in a video game. Our hero may be a fighter by nature, but not by training, and he's using the only tool at his disposal to keep the monsters at bay. This is conveyed well by forcing the player to mash the attack button as quickly as they can while running back and forth between possible threats. Despite the repetitive and simplistic nature of this game's combat, it's still just as tense as it should be, and you feel no less heroic by the end of each encounter than you would have with some impressive stunt between striking each foe. In place of more stressfully intricate combat, the player will likely find a similar tension through the platforming or general movement puzzles that come with escaping this crumbling fortress. This game feels like a very early predecessor to the sort of ledge-clinging adventures that would later be featured in the Uncharted and Assassin's Creed franchises, with our hero leaping across gaps that make the player clench every muscle in their body as they hope they gauge the distance correctly. Some of the structures you can climb are really impressive for this era, such as the large windmill that was featured on the game's final cover art. These obstacles aren't only remarkable for their size, but also how the player is expected to traverse them. The buildings or castle sections that make up this game's world are impressive in terms of architectural design alone. However, these imposing, vacant environments also do an excellent job of making the player feel small and lonely, a sensation that was heavily capitalized upon by the game's sound designers. The soundtrack of ICO was kept intentionally sparse with its use of both music and sound effects. The complete soundtrack only comes to about 25 minutes, with the majority of the pieces each being under a minute or two in length and only appearing during cutscenes. The lack of music throughout the player's adventure drastically adds to the sense of isolation in this disheveled castle, but also allows for the focus on ambient sounds, like the crashing of waves far below, or the blustering winds whenever walking across perilous exterior outcroppings. The music that does make an appearance is often ethereal and haunting, though also mystical. Visually speaking, ICO took heavy inspiration from Prince of Persia and Virtua Fighter, both of which were massively impressive steps forward for 2D and 3D graphics in video games at the time of their respective releases. You can observe the inspiration from these earlier milestones in gaming animations through our protagonist's extremely versatile range of movement as he climbs and jumps between ledges, ladders, and hanging chains. The animations for each character, though most obviously ICO himself, are exceptionally smooth thanks to Team ICO's revolutionary use of keyframe animation, which allowed much more context-sensitive movements from each part of the character's body without the need of explicitly motion-captured performances that had to reset to an idle pose between each animation. This is especially noticeable during fights, as the player runs around wildly sending and receiving blows in every direction. The game's state-of-the-art bloom lighting is beyond impressive for this era, and feels like one of the first steps made into the high-quality adventures that would only be possible on the PlayStation 2, as developers learned how to make this console really shine. With the use of this soft, realistic lighting mechanic, you can't really tell where the light emitted from one source stops. Instead, the light dissipates very naturally, which was pretty revolutionary for games at the time. This also means intentionally dim rooms actually look appropriately dark, rather than just difficult to see in. It's hard to tell in most lighting conditions because of how subtle it is, but aside from the shadows that ICO and Yorda cast from the environment's lighting, they also have a very discreet shadow around their character model's outline. This allowed the characters to really pop and stand out against the softly lit background, even without incredibly colorful or saturated designs of their own. This technique has since been adopted by plenty of games, such as the HD remaster of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, as a more visible example of the effect. The brilliant yet ambiguous light that surrounds this game's island castle is a great excuse for the world's boundary, without using some fuzzy digitized image in the skybox to simulate a distant horizon. Instead, we can just assume the light is reflecting off of the ocean's surface, and that there wouldn't be anything to see out that direction anyway. Over the years, numerous directors of both AAA titles and independent games have cited ICO as inspirational to their own works. These citations range drastically across countless genres and formats, with the designers behind games like The Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess, Halo 4, and The Last of Us, among countless others, all going on record to praise ICO's artistic impact on the world of gaming. Even Dark Souls and Bloodborne creator Hidetaka Miyazaki has stated that ICO was the title that inspired him to pursue game design, as it revealed to him the potential of video games as an artistic medium. This game's minimalistic approach to storytelling was also clearly inspirational in the artistic side of the indie gaming scene that would rise a decade later, demonstrated in titles like Limbo, Journey, and Braid. I think it's both fun and intriguing that the majority of the conflicts in this game actually feel quite imaginative from the point of view of our protagonist. When you step back, stripping away the dramatic presentation, avant-garde sound design, and bloom lighting, we're left with a young boy swinging a stick at shadows, dragging along a girl to who knows where. It feels quite innocent, yet also dramatic and honest. All the player can do is swing a stick to keep the monsters at bay and hold Yorda's hand if they try to take her. The stress of keeping Yorda safe, and sometimes rescuing her before she's pulled into the shadows, actually has the same earnestly stressful impact as the gameplay of Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo, as distant of a comparison as that may sound. But the two games actually handle the concept of an escort mission in a very similar manner, being that the escortee is in constant need of protection, and the player knows that this almost omniscient threat is standing by at a moment's notice in case they slip up for just a moment. Whether due to its captivating storytelling, groundbreaking visual feats, or mesmerizing sound design, ICO has consistently been recognized by audiences and critics alike to be a huge milestone in the history of gaming, and a dramatic shift in the art form as players found themselves becoming emotionally attached to virtually mute characters whom they only spent a few hours with. Even without attention-grabbing quips or heart-wrenching dialogue, the story of ICO and Yorda and the adventure they go on is quite simply a brilliant work of art that should be experienced by anyone wanting to see how gameplay alone can pull audiences into something much more impactful than could rarely have ever been expected or experienced from the act of pressing buttons on a controller. That is what's so great about ICO. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we considered what made ICO such a cult classic. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Perfect Dark, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.